they are both considered the Red Sea. The problem that you have with this Sinai Peninsula solution, which has been traditional for 1,500 years, is there's no archaeological evidence there. There's no geographical evidence there. The northern Sinai region at that time had a significant Egyptian military presence. In fact, during the time of Abraham referred to an area between the region of the Philistines and Egypt as the wilderness of Shur. In other words, that is a Hebrew term that speaks of a fortified area between the two lands. Another item that you need to make reference to is that Moses was returning to Mount Horeb, which we refer to as Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb, and it was in Midian. Midian was never on the Sinai Peninsula. The Midianites did not live in the land of Egypt. The Midianites were a nomadic people that lived in northwestern Saudi Arabia. And the real clincher for me is the Bible itself tells us where Mount Sinai is. The Apostle Paul writes to the Galatians and tells them in chapter 4, verse 25, "For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia." Now, I think he's a little closer to the heart of the subject with regards to the location of the real Mount Sinai than mystics 400 years later, who believe that they were establishing sacred sites by mysticism rather than historic proof. In fact, when you travel to Israel today, I love to quip when people go with me and say, if they built a church over it, probably nothing happened there. Because I found none of the traditional sites to really have any real historical evidence associated with any of the places. Paul ought to know, because we are told in Paul's own words that he goes to the backside of the wilderness where he spent 3 years being taught directly by God. And most Bible commentators believe that Paul, after his conversion in Damascus, went down into the land of Midian, probably went to Mount Horeb, the same place where Elijah fled and resided after his confrontation with the prophets of Baal and then the threatening of Jezebel. But Galatians says that this Mount Sinai is in Arabia. If the destination is Mount Horeb in Midian, then we need to examine, then where did the children of Israel cross the Red Sea? Now, if Midian is in southwest Saudi Arabia today, then let's look at the biblical account of the night before the event, where we're given some very interesting and specific details about the camp of Israel before they make the crossing. We read in verses 1 to 2, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, that they turn and camp before Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, opposite Baal-zephon. You shall camp before it by the sea." Now, you and I immediately look at that and think, well, that's a lot of information. I wonder if in the wilderness, if there were just a lot of signs. Well, of course not. The place of the crossing is a place which we first need to understand the timing of the crossing. It will help us understand how far they were in their travels. And it's one of the ways in which you can refute the idea of a few days out of the land of Goshen, they crossed the northern part of this Gulf of Suez or the Reed Sea, even further north than that. We know from Exodus chapter 19, verse 1, that they arrive at the foot of Mount Horeb, that is Sinai, after about 48 days. The Jews, of course, say they arrive there and are consecrated before God at 50 days. And therefore, that's why they say that the Feast of Pentecost is the feast which celebrates the birth of the nation of Israel, as they are consecrated before God at the foot of Mount Sinai. Interesting, isn't it? They claim Pentecost as the birth of the nation of Israel. The church claims Pentecost as the day of the birth of the church, both taking place 50 days after the deliverance of the nation of Israel. We're told in Exodus chapter 16 that they arrive in Midian 30 days after leaving the land of Goshen. So it takes them 18 days to go from arriving in Midian until they arrive at the foot of Mount Sinai. Therefore, we know, since it took them 3 days to find the springs of bitter water, and then some time after that until they reside at Elim, where there's the 12 springs and the 70 palms where they camp by the Red Sea, about 25 days after they leave the land of Goshen, they arrive at the crossing point. Now, let's take a look now at this area and speak about the Red Sea. The Red Sea itself is part of the Great African Rift. Its maximum depth is about 9,000 feet, about 3,000 meters deep. The Gulf of Suez, that portion of the Red Sea, which protrudes north and westerly from the Red Sea, the average width is about 20 miles, and the depth is between 200 and 300 feet. The Gulf of Aqaba ranges from 8 to 17 miles wide, and the depth is greater than 2,000 feet, in some areas 4,600 feet, much deeper. Now let's look at the 4 key descriptions again that we read in Exodus chapter 14, verses 1 to 2. We are told that they turn. The context there is they are traveling in the area from Ethan. They turn. They make a sudden turn from the direction they were going. They camp before Pi-hahiroth, which means in Hebrew, mouth of the channel. Number 3, they are to camp between Migdol and the sea. The word Migdol in Hebrew just simply means a mighty tower or fortress. Now, there certainly was no fortress there, but let me put it to you this way. If you were a Jew and you had lived your entire life on a plain, on a delta, all you would see is flat. You wouldn't know what a mountain was. But as you come to the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula, or you go through the region of the Sinai Peninsula, there are some exceedingly high mountains there. So we see that they are to turn suddenly, they are to camp before the mouth of the channel, and they are to camp between the tower or the fortress or the mountains and the sea. And it is to be opposite Baal Zephon. Baal Zephon, which means God of the north or God of the unknown. So pretty specific as to where this crossing takes place. Now, of course, the idea of the crossing at the Reed Sea, of course, none of those 4 specifics come to play there. They're focused so much on trying to force fit the interpretation of the Hebrew into the text that they then don't put it in the context of the entire passage.